Chair now recognizes Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your service as chairman of this committee, and thanks for the great job you've done for us as chairman. Secretary Blinken, thank you for your service. In this, your last appearance before this committee as Secretary of State, I do want to ask you some tough questions, though, about what I see as not only a chaotic retreat from Afghanistan, but probably the biggest foreign policy blunder of the administration over the last 4 years, but I would argue maybe even the last generation. The failure was not the 20-year fight against terrorism in Afghanistan. That was not the failure. In fact, that was a success, where the brave men and women of this country who wear our uniform kept the homeland safe because they took the fight to the terrorists. And in fact, we eliminated terrorists like Osama bin Laden because of their valor and their bravery. That was not the failure. The failure that dishonored their 20-year service was the chaotic and disastrous retreat. And so from your opening statements, you said it's important to put it in context, the events of August of 2021. Important, I agree. So let's talk about the Doha Agreement, Mr. Secretary. According to Ambassador Khalilzad, you believed the Taliban violated the Doha Agreement, and you purportedly advised President Biden during the interagency review to enforce the agreement's conditions that Secretary Pompeo, your predecessor, and Secretary Trump had entered into, and not withdraw until the Taliban complied. Why did you advise on this conditionality?
To be very clear, and again, I'm not going to get into my advice to the President. I can tell you what our policy was. The policy was to seek compliance with the agreement and to get the Taliban to live up to what it had promised to do.
Right, and I'm going to reclaim my time. Yes, I agree with that. But the Taliban failed to live up to the agreement. The Taliban failed to engage in intra-Afghan negotiations, correct?
That is correct.
The Taliban was inflicting violence on Afghan forces, correct?
That's correct.
And the Taliban conducted indirect fire attacks against American forces. Is that correct?
Prior to the evacuation, that may have been incidental, but everything else you said is certainly correct.
Well, I don't think President Biden listened to you, and I don't think he was implementing the Doha Agreement. It was not that he was bound by the Doha Agreement. He disregarded the Doha Agreement, and he said, we're going to retreat regardless of the Doha Agreement, and that's what happened here. Let me talk about NATO because...
Again, just to be clear, the Doha Agreement said we would be out by May 31st, 2021.
Yes,
that's
based on conditions, Mr. Secretary, and you know that. In fact, you acknowledged that the Taliban was failing to live up to the conditions, and so Doha did not bind your administration to retreat the way you did. Certainly not the way you did. Certainly not the way you did. Now, Mr. Secretary, I want to talk about NATO because you all talk about and tout this great strengthened NATO alliance. I was just in Europe in October. I agree NATO's strong, but it's not because of your retreat from Afghanistan. It's because of Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine that required NATO to get stronger despite the invitation to aggression that the retreat from Afghanistan gave to Putin. Let me ask you about NATO and how NATO felt about the policy of this administration back in 2021. According to the State Department documents that we subpoenaed, our NATO allies wanted the Biden-Harris administration to enforce the conditions of the Doha Agreement. You met with former NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg in March of 2021 at the NATO ministerial meeting, correct?
That's correct.
Yes, and according to State Department documents, Mr. Stoltenberg opposed an unconditional withdrawal, and you in response stated, quote, I share your view that it would be preferable to reach a political settlement before foreign troops depart. We've also learned that you were jolted by how strongly NATO officials argued against a complete withdrawal. Did you share NATO's concerns with the White House?
I shared everything I heard from NATO allies and partners, with the White House, with my colleagues, with the President. That's my job.
General Miller testified that NATO leaders were, quote, unhappy, unquote, with the President's unconditional withdrawal, and they, quote, voiced that unhappiness in different publications. Then, your number two, Mr. Cholette, lied to this committee stating NATO itself didn't take a position. We're told by public sources that NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg was, quote, livid, informing Secretary Austin and yourself that he, quote, strongly disagreed with the decision and felt that NATO's collective position hadn't been taken into account, unquote.
Yep. I'll let Mr. Stoltenberg speak for himself.
So
I have
here's
great
the bottom
respect
line.
for, but that's
NATO's
not the...
stronger today, but not because of you all. NATO is stronger because your weakness invited Putin to move against Ukraine. You signaled you weren't going to stand with our NATO allies. You didn't care. President Biden didn't care about our NATO allies and what they thought about a retreat from Afghanistan. Instead, what it did is it signaled weakness, and Putin took advantage of it. The reason NATO is stronger today is because of the invasion. It's not because of U.S. policy.
Now, that's incorrect. The reason
yield.
NATO is stronger today is because of President Biden's leadership. This alliance is bigger, it's better resourced, it's got more members because of his leadership. And if you ask any NATO ally, that's exactly
Gentleman's
what
time
they'll
has
tell you.
expired.